The healing at the pool. Sometime later, Jesus went up to Jerusalem for one of the Jewish festivals. Now there is in Jerusalem near the sheep gate a pool, which in Aramaic is called Bethesda, and which is surrounded by 5 covered colonnades. Here a great number of disabled people used to lie: the blind, the lame, the paralyzed. One who was there had been an invalid for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and learned that he had been in this condition for a long time, he asked him, "Do you want to get well?" "Sir," the invalid replied, "I have no one to help me into the pool when the water is stirred. While I'm trying to get in, someone else goes down ahead of me." Then Jesus said to him, "Get up, pick up your mat, and walk." At once the man was cured. He picked up his mat and walked. The day on which this took place was a Sabbath, and so the Jewish leaders said to the man who had been healed, "It is the Sabbath. The law forbids you to carry your mat." But he replied, "The man who made me well said to me, 'Pick up your mat and walk.'" So they asked him, "Who is this fellow who told you to pick it up and walk?" The man who was healed had no idea who it was, for Jesus had slipped away into the crowd that was there. Later, Jesus found him at the temple and said to him, "See, you are well again. Stop sinning, or something worse may happen to you." The man went away and told the Jewish leaders that it was Jesus who had made him well.
Brilliant. Thank you, Cara. We are carrying on our series, The 7 Signs of Jesus. And we are coming to the 3rd sign today, which is all about healing. And I don't know, sometimes I think questions have obvious answers. Questions have obvious answers. For example, do you want to go on holiday? Yes. Do you want to win the Father's Day race at your children's school? Yes. Do you pray that other dads or mums that might be faster than you don't come? Yes. There are obvious answers to some questions. Do you want to be tired? No. No, I don't want to be tired. And I think some obvious questions have obvious answers and that's it. But other obvious questions, like that last one, do you want to be tired? I find in myself I have an obvious answer and yet I do nothing about it. Let me paint a picture for you. Are you tired, Josh? Yes, I'm tired. Are you going to watch telly really late? Yeah, probably. Are you going to eat things that are going to keep you up? Yes, probably I would do that too. Sometimes obvious questions have obvious answers, but our response doesn't follow on. And today, the center of this passage, in many ways, is a really obvious answer to a question that is posed in verse 6. Do you want to be well? Yes. However, I think as we unpack some of this, we might realize that the way that we live day to day doesn't always show that our yes is how we live it out in practice. And I think that's helpful to be aware of as we go into this passage itself. Now, before we step in, let's step back. Over the last couple of weeks, Zim and Jamie have helped us understand this part of John's gospel. But John 20, verse 31, it says that that this gospel, the whole book, these signs that are building up, are written that we might know that Jesus is God and we may have life in his name. And actually, that's a helpful backdrop again to today, to going, what are we trying to achieve to decide that Jesus is God and that we may have life in his name today and all the way through to eternity. We've had water into wine, we've had the official Son, and now we have this healing and wellness, wholeness found in Jesus. As we look at the slide that comes up, a part of a picture's harder to see, but as it unveils, the picture becomes more and more easy to see what it might be. And yet still sometimes we have to look quite hard to really get it. And actually I think in the Gospel of John, things are being taken away a little bit at a time to help reveal a picture of who Jesus is. And that slide we just had up there is a picture of the place in today's passage, the pool of Bethesda. Okay, then that is where we're going to today. And I think it's important at the start of this talk, because I'm going to do something a little bit different, and it's going to be fine. We're here together, praise God. It's going to be okay. I'm going to do the talk today in 2 parts, with communion right in the middle of it. It's okay. It's going to be okay. And we're going to look through who is Jesus, what is his question, and how do we respond. And the two parts are going to be this. I'm going to tell you from the top. The two parts are going to be, it matters who is asking the question, do you want to be well? And it matters how we live out the answer. And before we come to communion, we're going to look at that first part, that it matters who's asking the question. Let's look back, if you would, with me. It's page 1068, looking at John chapter 5. And we'll go through it together just now as we kind of build this picture of who it is that is asking the question, because it matters who's asking the question. In the first few verses, we have described the picture that we just saw, the place where this is happening. And there was some sort of dispute, I suppose, around the validity of this story or even of John's gospel. But one of the things that really helped was they found it. They found this place exactly how described in the Bible, with the 5 colonnades and the pool as said, and they found out that it was very likely to be a place where a natural spring would have come up. You might have noticed, the eagle-eyed amongst you, that there was no verse 4 in our reading today. If you look in your Bible, you'll see that it's there at the bottom, because it's not in all manuscripts. But they found a mural of an angel stirring water. And that is what is described in that verse 4 of what would have supposedly been happening in that place where it was. And whether a divine act, whether it was superstition, whether it was some properties in the water, whether it was just warm and it helped sometimes, either way, we read in verse 3 that many, many people, a great number of people, used to lie there and wait for that moment where the water was stirred and try to be the first person in. The legend was, the hope was, the superstition was that if you were in first, you would be healed. A great number of people there holding out hope for some sort of fix to the problem that they had. And then we, in verse 5, see one of the main characters of the story, the man who is going to be healed by Jesus, spoiler alert. And he comes in, and it says that he has been lame for 38 years. We find out that he's been there for a long, long time. You'd imagine at this point, hope was going a little bit small, 38 years, and he hasn't been able to get into the pool he's poor in a sense that he's been there that long, but also you think, later on he tells us that no one was able to help into the pool. You think, well, maybe he's quite poor socially as well. You'd imagine 38 years, maybe at least once his friends would have been able to get him into the pool first, and yet it seems that that's not the case. And just to build a picture of 38 years, CDs were not invented yet 38 years ago, and we don't use them really anymore. That's a big one. 38 years, I wasn't born. I wonder, where were you? And for most of us, same answer as me, were you in 1986? It's a long time, 38 years, and it hadn't happened for this guy. And then, as is true in nearly every gospel narrative, the main character enters, and it's Jesus. And in verse 6, he comes with the question that we talked about, the question that is at the center of this passage: do you want to get well? Do you want to be well? And who's asking the question? It matters. It matters who's asking the question, because we best believe that if Jesus is God, he's able to back up all the answers to this question as well as ask the question itself. It matters who's asking the question of who has come into the narrative here. But you do feel a little bit for the guy and his response in verse 7. He says, I have no one to help me into the pool, and when the water is stirred, while I try to get in, someone else gets in ahead of me. And you think, well, he's missed the point here a little bit, but also it's kind of understandable. Someone random, turns out to be Jesus, who's God, but he doesn't know that yet. Somebody random has come through this area that is crowded and busy and asked an incredibly insensitive question to somebody who is there at a place where you're supposed to be if you want to get well, and said, do you want to get well? Do you want to be well? And in some ways, his response is fairly measured at that point. He's going, I'll educate this guy. It's a pool, that's what happens. I haven't managed to, I wish I could, etc., etc. But you have this thing where I suppose what he's about to realize is the person asking the question matters, because the person asking the question is going to be able to back it up. But maybe that's why Jesus never gets a yes from him. We don't see the big responses that you often see in healing stories in the Bible, where somebody has either sought out Jesus, knowing who he is and what he does. This is quite early in the gospel. Knowing who Jesus is, what he does, and coming expectant of healing. There's none of that here. But what we do learn about Jesus, and remember we're trying to unveil parts of this picture of who Jesus is we see Jesus as a compassionate God. Somebody who learns a story about somebody who's in a situation that is incredibly difficult for 38 years, and he moves towards this man. And there's hope for us there as well, that whether we are being deliberate about seeking Jesus or not, you best believe that he wants to seek you out, and that God of compassion is somebody that all of us can meet this evening. And so there is a sense of which when Jesus isn't getting the normal answer, there isn't a big response of my Lord and my God in this, but there is incredible hope about the compassion of Jesus in this story. And then Jesus speaks again. He says, verse 8, get up, pick up your mat, and walk. And we learned last week to take Jesus at his word. And we see and we best believe that it matters who's asking the question, but it also matters who is saying these words. When Jesus says this here, we see at the start of verse 9, that the man is cured. When it's Jesus asking, we know he can answer. When it's Jesus asking, we know that he can do something about what he asks. And it's the same for us today. The curer, wellness physically, here found in Jesus. And just a note on verse 9, on the end of that, talks about it being Sabbath. And Jesus knows it's Sabbath, and he decides to do this thing anyway. And there were some problems, and we're going to go into an interaction that the religious leaders and the man who's healed have a little bit later on after communion. It's going to be okay. And we're going to go through that a little bit later on. But first, it's worth noting that Jesus, and you see it if you want to look in the chapter later this week, you see that he has a big conversation with the religious leaders about why essentially it doesn't really matter that it is Sabbath in this context. He talks about how my Father is at work and I am following him. He talks about how it says that the words the scriptures are teaching about me. He's trying to explain to them something completely new to them, but maybe easier for us to get. Hey guys, I'm God. He's building that picture. He's building it here in this passage, and he's building it for us. But Jesus also knows that there's a bigger story. We see him slip away, and you think that's a bit odd. Why isn't there an interaction there in that moment? And I wonder whether the key to that is found in the conversation that then happens between Jesus and this man in verse 14. If you just have a look, Jesus re-enters the story. He slips back into the story and wants to be really clear on what the agenda is here. He wants to be really deliberate in recognizing that there's been a wellness that's happened physically, but there's still a need of a wellness that needs to be happening spiritually. And one wasn't dependent on the other, but he says, hey, something worse might happen. And we, as maybe people who've been around church for a while, go, it's sin, it's, long-term knowing God forever, and it is absolutely that. But put yourself in this story for a minute. 38 years and suddenly he can walk, and Jesus has the audacity to come back and say there's something worse. This is probably the best day of his life for quite some time. And yet Jesus is wanting to be really clear that there is another narrative here. There's another part of his wellness that is more important to the mission of Jesus Christ on earth, both then and to us now. And he recognizes that it's Jesus who is his curer. He says that in verse 15. So, do you want to be well? It matters who is asking the question. And for many of us, we've already decided that Jesus is God. We've chosen to follow him. So when it looks at do you want to be well, so today we need to ask ourselves that question about being deliberate, about remembering what Jesus has already done for us, and then looking at what it looks like to walk step by step in the wellness that was won for us and is won for us on the cross. Jesus knows what we truly need in verse 14. Something worse may happen to you, and it's not may, but it's will. And if we hark back to that verse that we said at the start from John 20:31, when it's talking about life in his name, it is talking about eternity with Jesus. It is talking about that. But it's also talking about life day to day with God as a follower of Jesus. It's both of those things. And Jesus on the cross gave us a place for our sin to go. He's the solution to his own warning in verse 14. It happens all the time, it seems, in the New Testament, that Jesus will say something and be the solution to the problem that he poses. Jesus will ask us to do something, and he will give us absolutely everything we need to respond and to do it. I love that because that's just really helpful, isn't it? And if you might notice this declaration that the man makes that it's Jesus who made him well. And I think it's important to know what that we mean in that passage. So if you look at 6, 11, and 14, you see the word well 3 times. And in verse 9, you see the word cured. And for all of these, they come from the same root of it's all about wholeness and wellness. It's found in Jesus' body, mind, and teaching. There is a wholeness to Jesus being able to back up the question, Do you want to be well? I can do that in your soul, I can do that in your body, and I can do that when it comes to the message that I'm bringing and your response to that message. And as we come to communion in a moment, we're entering into essentially verse 14 and 15, deciding that it's Jesus that makes us well, saying sorry for the wrong that we do, remembering the sacrifice that Jesus has made for us on the cross, reminding ourselves of the identity we have in him. I'm not very good at remembering things. I've shared before forgetting my children's birthdays. The other day, and this one was a little bit more awkward in a different way, I was sitting, as I do sometimes, with my wife in the lounge about to watch a new Netflix series, and I was like, oh, we should watch that. I've watched it, but I'm happy to watch it again. It's really good. She was like, yeah, I know, we watched it together. Now, this isn't like a one series piece on BBC that you forget about. This was 5 seasons of a major TV show. It turns out I completely forgot I watched it with my wife. Thought I'd watched it on my own, and I'll be honest with you, that didn't go that well. The conversation that followed, but I guess I'm illustrating that the human condition, or at least for me, maybe it's not for you, is I forget. I forget so much, and I even find myself forgetting the things that are most important, not just what TV shows I've watched. And as we come to communion, we get to recognize the human condition to forget and to remember Jesus. This Jesus, who is God, who says to you, do you want to be well today? It's not me asking the question, I can't do anything. I'm posing this question as we come to communion on behalf of Jesus. Do you want to be well? It was really cool to find out that Bethesda, this pool that we read about, the one that's in verse 2, that means home of mercy. Home of mercy. At this pool where mercy is shown to somebody, where Jesus, the person who brings mercy to all of us, shows up and shows that he's God once again. Home of mercy. I love that. God who has mercy on us appears. A mercy extended to us today as we celebrate communion. The signs in John's gospel have been culminating there. We're going to continue to over the next few weeks. And ultimately what they lead to is Jesus' death and resurrection. The proof that Jesus is God, and they've led to the church, and they've led to us eventually. And as we come to communion, we're remembering all of that history, all of what it means to be a follower of Jesus, to be the church, to recognize our place in that as we come to Jesus, to recognize the successful mission of Jesus to you and to me. And when we come to communion, we're going to have these words said over us in a moment. And I just want to be deliberate about linking what we're about to do to what it is that we're learning in Scripture today. And then as we come out the other side of communion, I want to be deliberate about saying it's at the center because it's where we go to, and it's also the place we come from in response. It's a very deliberate trying to do that. This is what we'll have said over us. When we turned away, you did not reject us, but came to meet us in your Son. In Christ, you shared our life that we may live in him and he in us. He opened his arms of love on the cross and made for all the perfect sacrifice for sin. Something worse. Not a problem in Jesus. Come. And this is our response. Yes, I want to be well. I want to remember the freedom that you've won for me. Maybe this is for the umpteenth time, or maybe for the first time you can engage today and say, I want to be well in Jesus. We'll be told to draw near with faith, to receive the body and blood in remembrance that he has made us well in him, to remember our wellness in him. And let this response be our foundation today. Thank you, my Lord and my God. I am well in you. As we've been deliberate about putting communion at the center here, I want to encourage us that this is the foundation by which we then look, how do we walk out our wellness in Jesus? As we remember him in the sacrifice that he made for us on the cross, we decide to be deliberate about living with that identity in mind. And in some ways, this focus on the big in the communion is the main thing, but it can also impact tomorrow. And so maybe to the question, do you want to be well? It is a really easy, emphatic yes. I do, thank you. And for lots of us, that's where we have decided to follow Jesus. That's great. Fantastic. And for some of us, we're still on that journey of working it out. But for all of us, as we look to be challenged by this next part, I want to say that there are going to be pieces for all of us that we can be deliberate about involving Jesus in what it looks like to live out the wellness that we have in him because of the cross. So the second part of when we're answering the question, do you want to be well, is that it matters how we live out the answer. It matters how we live out the answer. If life in all of its fullness is the goal, then our yes to being well in Jesus, we hope, should be followed by freedom and peace and purpose and hope. And I've known those times in my life, and I've seen how that can happen. But I don't know about you, I've also known the opposite, where I'm walking day by day and don't feel well at all. And those things feel hard to come by. So often, when life plays itself out, even though we know the one that wellness is found in, where wholeness is found, I think we forget to remind ourselves of what that can look like in different areas of our lives, where we look to find answers beyond Jesus, to avoid traps, as it were, to involve wrong responses. And I think there's two that we can look at or we can shoot from in this passage to help us see some areas that, as I've prayed about this passage and thought about this passage, might be helpful as we look to say, I want to be somebody who lives out the answer of, yes, I want to be well in Jesus. And the first, going back to verse 7, have a look if you want to in chapter 5 of John, where the man, understandable, but still I think a helpful thing for us to look at, is essentially responding to the Son of God in front of him, telling him about a cultural superstition of the time. The way that he is looking to be well comes from a cultural remedy. And I don't know if you agree, I think at the moment we're in a time, and it's not the only time this has happened in history, where people are spiritually awake and interested, which means that there is spirituality all over the place. There's so many options in the culture of our day of where we can find wellness and answers in a spiritual context of what it might look like, the superstitions of our time. And there's an awkward claim of Christianity that I think it's worth reminding ourselves of as we look at this passage and the way that the man's immediate thing was to say, oh, well, I've tried to get well, this is how it is here, is to go, actually, Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, not a way, a truth, and a life. And so if something that we're doing in the context of our spirituality doesn't line up with Jesus as the Son of God or doesn't put him first, then it is not the way, it is a way. And I want to encourage us to be deliberate as followers of Jesus about saying the answer is Jesus. Yes, there are other things, spiritual practices that I do in my life, but if they're not pointing towards him or they become legalistic in whatever way, then we need to be a little bit careful. And this next thing is not superstitions. In some ways, they're man-made fixes, but as I thought about them, I think there's an over-reliance sometimes, or at least this is our first port of call, not a part of what it looks like to be a follower of Jesus. And to be clear, I try to do these things well. Eating well, finding time to sleep, exercising, understanding your own mental health. I found therapy really helpful in understanding how my brain works in order to be able to come and say, I want to be well, I want to know wellness. But actually, if none of these are ever in line with Jesus being part of it, I think sometimes we can end up making these things the be-all and end-all when it comes to our wellness. And I find myself so often realizing I haven't even brought it to Jesus. I haven't even prayed about it or thought about it. When I go on a run, if I ever do, some of you do that more than me, I can be reminded of what the freedom is when it comes to running outside. That was a bad example for me. I haven't run in ages. But I did run around a tennis court the other day. Maybe I could be reminded of freedom in that context. When you are preparing food that is good for you, you can be reminded of the provision of Jesus. I'm saying involve him in what it looks like to be well, but definitely don't miss out on Jesus being the first thing, the first place we go. How quick are we to go to prayer rather than trying to edit our schedule so that we can work out how we can find wellness next week? Let's be deliberate about going to Jesus. And then the other one, I said we'd come back to that conversation in verse 9 to 12 between the religious leaders and the man that had been healed. And they're essentially objecting to Jesus doing what he just did on Sabbath, that this man has picked up his mat on Sabbath and he's walked away. And they are objecting when clearly something has just happened that is a God thing, only could be a God thing, and immediately they're going to the religious complaint, the legalistic moment that they're having. And I do think we sometimes look at the religious leaders and go, oh, we definitely wouldn't do that. But I think in this one, the desire there may be for them. Maybe it's a good desire with a bad reaction. The desire is I want to walk out my faith in a way that is absolutely right. But the bad thing is they missed Jesus as God in front of them. And I wonder what kind of things, maybe theological things or questions that we have, stop us from missing the offer of life in all of its fullness from Jesus because we're just looking at the issues we have and not allowing Jesus to be part of the answers to them. As I thought about this in my own life, I was thinking through times where, quiet times, my time alone with God has been more about ticking a box and making sure that I've done it, and well done me, I'm religiously on point, this is great, but realizing I've just not met with Jesus. Nothing has changed. Nothing has been given to him. Nothing has been taken from me. There is a reality to sometimes I think we can get into these moments where we're just having a tick box thing and it has not come from a place of relationship. If Jesus gives life in all of its fullness, we can trust that in relationship with him, we can bring the things that we are wrestling with, struggling with, unsure about. How often do we have a problem that stops us from living out our wellness in Jesus? And maybe in this context, what I mean is absolutely going for it. In every area of our lives, being a follower of Jesus, how often does one thing, a barrier, a question that we have, a struggle that we're going through, become the barrier to accessing that life in all of its fullness found in Jesus? And if we can imagine that the problem or whatever it is, the thing, and some of you are thinking of them right now, is here and Jesus is over there, then we have a barrier. But can I encourage you, what it means to be a follower of Jesus is that we can put it over here and walk arm in arm with Jesus and access him as we look at that problem together. I am not saying don't have questions. I'm not saying don't wrestle. I'm not saying there isn't going to be difficult times in life where there is something that is overtaking everything we're thinking about. I'm saying Jesus knows, he cares, and he's got you covered. He can walk with you in those things. And I wonder whether that is a helpful thing as we look at this to go, actually there was a moment here where they missed Jesus in front of them. And maybe an opportunity to meet with him because they were too bothered about other stuff going on. And I wonder if there's also non-negotiables for us in what it looks like to know Jesus and to have time with him. I think there's so many great writers at the moment talking about spiritual practices and rule of life and the different ways that we can set ourselves up to know rest well and to know patterns of prayer and all these different things. And they come from people in the early church that were written, and all of the time they're wanting to point us back to God's word and to Jesus himself. That is the aim of these authors. As you read some of those books, you can see that's what it is. And maybe this is just me, but I can see in my own life where suddenly some of those spiritual practices that I've put in with the right intention for the right goal become non-negotiable. To the point where I miss an opportunity to move in compassion to somebody else as Jesus with me. And I do think there's a question for some of us, and not all of us, to ask. And if it's you, you'll know that this is you, to be deliberate about saying, am I still listening for that small, still voice of God saying, not today, go and help that person. Or whatever it might be. I just think we need to be deliberate and recognize that sometimes we can be over legalistic or religious in the way that we follow Jesus. If Jesus isn't first and at the center, we may end up with some problems. Robert Murray McShane, a Scottish pastor in the 1800s, said this: for every look at yourself, take 10 looks at Christ. It's probably 1-1 for me. Maybe like 2 to me, 1 to God. I'm just being honest. And as we think about it ourselves, I'm pretty sure there's not many 1 and 10 going on here because we're so deliberate about fixing things ourselves, about looking for what the earthly thing could be that could help us. We're followers of Jesus. We know God. He can help us in these things. And as we look to respond to this question, do you want to be well? Saying it matters how we live out the answer, I would like to suggest 2 things as we come into the end of this talk. Apply Jesus as God to your life. What attitude, situation, hope, or dream or complaint have you forgotten to tell that you know the living God? And imagine how much it will change when you do. Because it matters who's asking the question. Jesus is able to back up his answer to wellness. He can do it, and he can do it in you. And the other thing is to walk out wellness in him. In verse 8, the man got up. He got up. In response to Jesus telling him to, he did. And actually there's a deliberateness about saying, because on the face of it, he had quite low faith. Jesus was needed. And for all of us, as we're told to get up and walk in the wellness that Jesus has won for us, we can be sure that he will give us the power and the strength to do it. For every 1 look at our own weakness, we can take 10 looks at the strength of Jesus. So in a moment when I go through some areas that maybe you want to respond to today, you don't have to get the courage from somewhere deep down. You can look to Jesus as we respond to him together. to give a willing, yes, I'm going to get up and walk in wellness today. I'm going to invite the band to come and join me. So what is it at the moment in our minds that is at the front, the back, the middle of our minds? What is it at the moment that we're thinking about when it comes to I want to walk out my wellness in Jesus? Scared about the future? Jesus holds it. Anxiety taking over? Jesus cares and he draws near to you. Have a theological trickiness, whatever it might be. Jesus is the truth. Test it. Bring it to him. He can take it. Stuck in a pattern of thinking or sin, forgiveness and wholeness is found in Jesus. Got an unresolvable situation? It's Jesus' speciality. He loves them. Bring them to him. Have a hope that you worry will never be. Bring it to Jesus. And for some of us, we're wanting to be people that move in compassion towards others, but there are barriers to that in what it looks like to grow in our deep love for other people. If that's you today, Jesus can change our hearts where we find that difficult sometimes to be deliberate about going out to other people. Maybe you know today that you need healing. Physical, spiritual, emotional. Wholeness is found in Jesus. Maybe you're just exhausted with life and plodding on. Fall into Jesus today. Do the answers to these things always look like we think they should? No. But that's because Jesus is God, not us. He asks us to get up. So in perfect timing, let's stand together, shall we?